Thanks so much, folks, for coming and joining me for a quick little chat. So the topic that I thought would be fun to talk about, those of you, yeah, I got it. We're recording. Um, the the reason why I kind of want to do this topic, those who know me know that I've been kind of I keep writing little bits and pieces and giving presentations about the portrayal of mining in popular culture. Eventually, I've actually now recently decided that I'm clearly going to have to write a book about it because I keep doing presentations about it. I think originally it was a lark where I was just thought it'd be fun to do some of this for kicks because I couldn't get into the archives or things like that, and so eventually this became kind of a bit of a different project. And what what I'm going to present today is related to a show that I guess a lot of you have probably seen because it's one of the most popular shows on American television, and that is the show Gold Rush. Who's actually seen Gold Rush? You should raise your hand. A lot of you, some of you. Okay. We got a bunch. Oh, there we go. Get the actual hand raises. That's perfect. So it's been around for a little bit, and what I'll do to kind of jump in here on this topic is to give you kind of a yeah, that's right. The media genre ate itself. What I'll give you here is kind of a quick insight into my kind of analysis here. I've maybe gone too deep into this particular show, but what we'll get into in particular is a spin-off called Parker's Trail in a little bit, but I'll talk kind of at first about the general show Gold Rush and what I kind of see in it. And I think the basic point that I'd start with is that I've kind of found that the portrayal of mining in popular culture, especially when it comes to mining itself, I think American popular culture just remains stuck in the past, right? So if you play a video game that's about mining today, you're doing low tech picks and axes, when you listen to country songs, right, they're about, tough times and company towns back, they're clearly related to a century ago. You can go on YouTube and type in mining, and almost everything on there are YouTube videos of people exploring abandoned mines. I think there's maybe a few reasons for this, but one of my favorite explanations comes from a book that Dean McCannell wrote in 1976 called The Tourist. And essentially, he argues there that the tourist destinations and historic sites enact what he calls a museumization of essentially of jobs and workers, right, of industrial jobs and their workers for the benefit of tourists. Really kind of making industrial work, or at least the image of industrial work, being stuck in the past because it's more comfortable for tourists to consume it that way. And there's a lot of other historians who agree. Stephen High has written that, that people museumify former industrial landscapes, despite a lot of worries that this kind of act can sanitize and romanticize what it can often be an uncomfortable past. And, even though they're set in the present day, reality TV shows, I think, also do some sanitizing and romanticization of industrial work, although they're really doing it in this case, right, for the sake of couch-bound, not wandering tourists. They often rely essentially on reenactments of the past, just like a lot of industrial and heritage sites that we've all been to. And I think this approach shows up especially in this popular US series Gold Rush, which since it began in 2010 has often served as the Discovery Channel's top rated show in the US, and has these multiplying spin-offs. I won't name them all, but it's like Gold Rush South America, Gold Rush Whitewater, Gold Rush Dave Turin's Lost Mine, Gold Rush Winter's Fortune. There's a whole bunches of them. And they have all proven very lucrative for the network too. In March 2020, the Gold Rush franchise featured 4 of the top 5 cable series amongst all American viewers ages 25 to 54, with men in particular driving up its ratings. And I think the funny thing to me is that the show really kind of ostensibly provides viewers with this window into modern day mining. But really, it's relying on these kind of long-standing, old, nostalgic tropes about resource extraction. It's kind of part of this funny genre of reality TV that I've found different labels: macho TV, real men at work, tough guy TV. There's a whole bunch of these. I mean, among the most popular of these shows are things like Axemen, Bering Sea Gold, Deadliest Catch has been long very popular, and almost all these do the same thing. They feature small groups of usually white guys joining in small bands, braving extreme conditions, and practicing the tough work of natural resource extraction. And the Gold Rush franchise has probably received the most attention by folks who are kind of pop culture critics and really masculine reaction to the Great Recession, because the first seasons came out right after it, and were kind of people who had lost their jobs in the recession and were kind of seeking new fortune in the Alaskan gold fields. There are other critics, though, who think that the real reason why it's been so popular is its depiction of a rugged frontier. And I agree. I mean, I think it provides this kind of romantic nostalgia for a North American frontier, which itself is kind of a fraught idea at this point, kind of implies a lot of adventure and exploration when, of course, European settlement all over the place in the 18th and 19th centuries often meant violent conquest too, right? And so what I'm going to talk a little bit about here is how this kind of frontier nostalgia also gets used to really obscure the modern mining industry. It by embracing this imagined kind of mining past, it makes you think, it wants to take you back to a time when life was simpler and risk taking was celebrated, and men performed tough work in nature, and didn't sit behind desks all day like I usually do. And so I think that for me is one of the interesting things about this. And I think it does this. I mean, Gold Rush really kind of replays old gold rushes, given its name, as these kind of contemporary adventurers, right? But really, it's kind of these guys going out and conquering exoticized and often quite cold places. The show's stories almost always focus on small-scale prospecting, right? So artisanal mining, suggesting there are this gamble that small groups of tightly bonded, enterprising men can successfully undertake, just like their forebears did. For prospectors in Gold Rush, this kind of resourceful toughness and the finding of small specks of gold are really this true pathway to mining success. And so it's interesting to me because you get this kind of portrayal of all these kind of frozen landscapes and challenging backcountry, and not really what these places are, right? Which are long inhabited places of modern industrial development. And so I'd argue that the show's sentimental portrayal of these small groups of men obscures the fact, that mining today is a highly capitalized industrial affair in the most cases, right? Run by massive global corporations. And instead, what you get is this kind of landscape unburdened by, modern trappings like global capital, workforce that's diverse, environmental concerns. And so viewers get this and they kind of believe that modern day miners are just kind of simply continuing nostalgic practices of the past and not doing, extraction in the present. So let me kind of talk very briefly here about a few kind of examples that I would use to hold up against it. And that's really that, because the Gold Rush franchise harks back to this, global era of 19th century gold rushes, right? Which began mostly in 1848, but as most of you know, right, continued all over the place, right? The Pacific Rim, Australia, New Zealand, parts of Africa. And in the North America, right, we're looking especially at the American West and Western and Northern Canada, where, every new find triggered a new gold rush. And so certainly gold brought people from all over the world to all these different mining areas in North America. But it's also true that in general, like these Anglo settlers came to dominate the social, political, and legal systems there. And so, it's also clear to me that mining kind of continued and sometimes even initiated the colonization and kind of settlement of new areas. And along with that, right, you get these new gold rush stories, right? And they typically say things about, men showing up and facing great uncertainty in these unfamiliar lands. They're truly independent. They're kind of often juxtaposing this new independent feature of their lives with these non-white people that they encounter along the ways. And whether done through letters home or newspaper stories back east, right, you get these things that literary scholar Janet Floyd calls kind of triumphalist stories, right? Ones where these individualistic guys, triumph over a harsh environment. And these themes became especially prominent at the turn of the 20th century. I have to always remember what century I'm turning to, due to events in Canada. In Canada, just as in the U.S., right, mining, mineral exploration was certainly central to Canadian settlement, just like it was here. And the last rush of North America's Gilded Age happened in the Klondike region of Canada's Yukon. A widespread depression coupled with an emerging mass media, which promoted it to everybody, turned that rush into a global phenomenon. And so in this very short period, 1896 to 1899, the Klondike Stampede, as they called it, drew at least 100,000 prospectors, many from the United States, to this previously remote area of northern Canada. And this Klondike Gold Rush also became one of the most romanticized rushes in the world. And historian Ken Coates even pointed out in a book I was just reading that it really fit well with the era's fascination with adventure novels. I was thinking about Rider Haggard's King Solomon's Mines, for instance, right, as a good example. And many also sense that this Klondike would be this kind of truly democratic rush. Anybody could go out and make their fortune with a little bit of luck. And these little clippings I have up here come from the San Francisco Call, which was a newspaper. This edition is from 1898. And it had this kind of, I think, what are good examples of this rhetoric. You have this large spread titled "Picking Up Millions in Alaska." And this is featuring these successful gold rush hunters' tales. And miner George Clancy, discusses his discouraging trials in the biting cold, but still celebrated his, the luck that he had when he picked up a fortune just by scratching $10,000 out of the earth with a stick. One of the wives interviewed in this newspaper said, believed Alaska and the Yukon were a hard country for a woman, and she wouldn't take the responsibility of advising any of her sex to go to the Klondike. But these are kind of, funny stories to me. And it's in some ways weird that they're the ones that really are most prominent when you look at a lot of the language and discussions about the gold rush at the time. To the Klondike, it admits certainly the very real presence of women in northern mining areas. You don't really hear much about them, including both indigenous women and migrants who work their own claims. And so, you have these kind of stories happening at the time, and then this gets translated into fiction, right? So this is probably my favorite book when I was a kid, and I just reread it with my 9-year-old maybe a few months ago. This is The Call of the Wild. It remains probably the most famous literary representation of the Klondike Gold Rush. And here in this tale, you get a dog named Buck. He's stolen from his kind of idyllic Southern California home. He's brought to the supposedly uncivilized Klondike. But, Buck becomes the best of the sled dogs. He learns to physically dominate them. His experience in the harsh environment leads him to become progressively feral, i.e. he has heard the call of the wild. And in fact, when the Native American Yeehats murder his owner, he goes back and kills several of them in vengeance. Eventually joins a wolf pack at the end of the novel. Here this is interesting because we get kind of this story that gets repeated over and over again, right? You get this like white guy hero. In this case, it's in the form of a dog, though. He learns the ways of the unforgiving environment, and he comes to kind of dominate the locals. And certainly, although people like Jack London and the letter writers of the San Francisco Call that we just heard, they'd all traveled to the Klondike, but the public rhetoric really kind of gave little thought to those original inhabitants, except as kind of obstacles to overcome. And we know that in the Klondike, right, there was a village was forcibly removed, right, to make a way for Dawson City, for instance. So that gets kind of omitted. And the other interesting thing that always gets omitted, interesting to me, is all the stories that you get from letters and journals from men and women who return from the Klondike, broke, and often themselves kind of broke in some way. This is a little clip from a journal that I found from Edward Sharp. He went to the Klondike region in the original rush, and he has this first diary that's an exciting adventure, towards fortune. We get drama and comedy. It was published in the Seattle Argus in 1897, but his second diary, which was not published, is a painful, grueling trip back south, right? He didn't get any money. He was suffering from tuberculosis the whole time. He dies almost exactly when he kind of ends the trip. That second diary, right, was not published, right? It didn't fit this kind of public romantic view of the Klondike Rush. And I would say that, the lessons of that kind of public rhetoric were simple, right? That the cold North was going to be conquered by these respectable men. And, that kind of that idea of failure was just kind of omitted entirely, right? Even though it was very common. And there's probably a few reasons why this rhetoric didn't match reality. And, maybe the most common one that you would all think of, at least is the one I thought of. I mean, one is just kind of this long-standing association in both Canada and the US between less populated areas, right, and individual freedom. And certainly by the middle of the 19th century, this kind of idea of a Wild West, that connected real people, right, like Daniel Boone, and mythical characters like all the folks from the Leatherstocking Tales. They kind of got thought of as, part of, leading to adventure and, camaraderie in the open air. And, they get to rely on their backcountry skills. Male characters can kind of make and remake themselves, right, because they're away from centers of power. And so that kind of gets tied into this other idea that becomes really common at the turn of the century, right when the Klondike's happening in the US, that we'd call kind of frontier nostalgia, right? They became really concerned about the loss of this frontier, right? And so the kind of best example that is often turned to by historians is that of another historian, Frederick Jackson Turner. And he talks about this, he thinks that the Americans' encounter with this unpopulated frontier, the wilderness, as he terms it, as they move west, was what made them American, right? They had to struggle in these, amidst all these new obstacles, and that turned them into kind of stalwart, rugged, restless folk, who were truly individualistic. And Turner even claimed that that frontier experience is what created American democracy, right? So you can understand why, if you think that it's created everything that makes America Americans, America, and Americans, Americans, right, that they'd be pretty upset and worried about it. And, Teddy Roosevelt here in our picture is a pretty good example of this belief, right? I mean, Teddy, goes out and he celebrates the strenuous life right out west. He thinks that that's what made him, right, learn the value of hard work and regain his physical strength and, learn how to be bold. And, there was this belief at that time, many Americans kind of agreed that this lack of a frontier that they were facing would feminize American men. So they, and that was going to hurt people in general, right? And so they wanted to go out of their way to save wild spaces. So it was helping to drive some of the conservation movement. Organizations like the Boy Scouts, of which I'm a proud Eagle Scout member, were formed partly for that reason. And I think even kind of increasing the kind of outwardness in global affairs in Roosevelt's time was one of these kind of ideas that you kind of be able to test and renew yourself, right? And Klondike Stampeders, they imbibed this kind of hinterland mythos, or whatever we want to call it. I mean, if you look at all their initial letters home, before many of them experienced failure, right, they expressed this kind of a rejection of industrial urban life. Historian Margaret Morse has kind of looked through a bunch of these letters, and talks a lot about how they were kind of looking to gold mining in this rush for things that they felt were absent in their urban life, right? Adventure, simplicity, freedom, independence, connection between hard work, right, and making wealth. Kind of missing an invigorating physical engagement with nature, right? That all these things were kind of missing from their normal lives. Okay, so let's get to the actual show, which is why you're really here. And so over a century later here, I would say that the reality TV series Gold Rush, this is the first one, Gold Rush Alaska, that started in 2010. I mean, I think it really reiterates a lot of these same kind of frontier rush ideas. It began its run in 2010 by portraying Oregon father and son Jack and Todd Hoffman, who were here on the front here as average but now unemployed men who want to better provide for their families. They decide to gamble on their future by venturing out to Alaska to find gold. Todd leaves behind the women in his family, but he takes his sons, right? So it's kind of this multi-generational male challenge. In season 1, Alaska proves unforgiving for inexperienced gold hunters. Their hard work, right, gets kind of valorized by the show, but the Hoffmans themselves, right, underestimate how much work it's going to take to get this gold mining operation off the ground. And so the end result is something like 15 ounces of gold, right? Certainly not enough to have actually funded an operation. But, right, they also received plenty of money from the network to be on the show, which made this enterprise worth their time and money. And so they return, right, in season 2. They're more confident in their mine, but they fail again, all right? And then eventually head to the famous mining region of the Klondike. And in that season 2, we get kind of new characters, most of whom also similarly are white guys who are kind of seeking to mine the northern landscape, just as in 19th century mining stories. One of the new cast members is the guy that you see in this image here is Parker Schnabel, who at age 16 takes over his grandfather, John Schnabel's Big Nugget mine. And the series kind of eventually splits into parts, right? You follow the Hoffmans in some sections, Fred Hurt and his crew and others, Tony Beats and others, and Parker Schnabel and his foreman, Rick Ness and others. The show's been on for a while, right? In September 2021, the show kicked off, I think it was 12th season. But at this point, right, the Hoffmans have even left the main show. New miners have become important cast members. And likely because his family owned good property and already had a background in mining, Parker Schnabel, you see here, is probably among the most successful actual mining on the show. And starting in season 3, he's actually typically made more money from mining than the other cast members. And that actually brings me to my next point, which is the amount of money. Okay, so, as might be expected for a show titled Gold Rush, right? The show spends a lot of its time focusing on the actual gold being mined. But the figures are often quite low, right? I mean, this is artisanal mining, especially in the early seasons. I mean, in season 2, we learn that if the Hoffmans do not make 100 ounces of gold this season, their investors are going to pull out. In that same season, Parker Schnabel's, and he has to make a last-ditch effort to find gold at another property. I mean, these are kind of like elements they use to play up the drama, even if it's really unclear if anyone's actually truly in danger of complete failure, especially given all this complementary income they're making, right, from the TV network. Indeed, they kind of use the low amounts of gold to increase the tension, to kind of show you that the miners aren't going to hit their expectations. But I mean, the funny part about this is, of course, as anyone knows from mining, right? I mean, that's really a pittance when you compare it to the large enterprises make up the modern mining industry. This is just one that the Mining History Association went to, so I was there. This is Alaska's Fort Knox gold mine. It's run by a Toronto-based Kinross, I think still, and it pays $80 million in annual wages to 650 employees, right? This is kind of more typical of your mining industry here. They poured something like 260,000 ounces of gold last year. I mean, so, the biggest gold mines in Canada create even more, revenue. I think the Canadian Malartic is, they're doing something like 55,000 tons a day, right? 569,000 ounces of gold in just a shortened season for COVID. So, I mean, these are totals that are clearly dwarfing the figures of those artisanal miners on Gold Rush. I mean, the largest amount of gold mined by any of the crews on Gold Rush so far was Parker Schnabel's crew, which I think made 7,500 ounces at one point in season 11. I mean, other crews have been much less successful. I mean, season 7, Todd Hoffman's group completely failed at one site in Oregon, in the state of Oregon. So then the crew moves, and then they barely reach break even at a Colorado site. I mean, in other words, the crews are practicing small scale mining on Gold Rush. I would just general say, right, it's not representative of how most mining industry works. And yet we don't see, right, the rest of that mining industry ever on these kinds of shows. So instead, what you get, right, are kind of these small scale enterprises, right, that you use to celebrate miners as resourceful entrepreneurs, right? So just like earlier Gold Rush stories kind of celebrate their own protagonists. So Parker Schnabel, right, he becomes kind of treated as this gold mining prodigy because of his young age. I mean, that's, which I guess he to some extent is, but he's also was handed a successful mining operation by his grandfather, right? The show's narration continually tells viewers about how industrious and resourceful the crews are, as they kind of manipulate old mill technology or build roads and, dig water-filled glory holes. I mean, in the view of the show, these small teams are successful due to their own skills, not due to kind of the reliance on knowledge and technology and of the global extractive industry. So, I mean, really, I guess I would argue just kind of it draws on these kind of older ideas about the West and North, right? These places where you can be a self-made man, proving your worth. And indeed, I'd say no one on the show is clearly portrayed as working for anyone else, right? Like they have these crews set up. But even, if you take the example Parker Schnabel, so he has Rick Ness serves as his foreman for most of the seasons. But I mean, we hardly ever hear about the fact that he's kind of lower on the totem pole. And he's even allowed to disagree with his boss often to kind of increase tension on the set, right? And when eventually, right, he kind of proves his own mining prowess and he gets his own crew and his own operation. Well, when we do meet other crew members, they're usually kind of like portrayed as roughly equal members of a camaraderie, right? Not workers trying to earn a paycheck. And when a crew member leaves, it's not because, right, their performance is low or something. It's usually something dramatic, like cast member Dave Turin left the show after a fist fight with another crew member, right? not because, something was going wrong otherwise. So in other words, right, you don't really think about kind of normal employer worker relations, right? It's just more kind of like adventure and camaraderie, right, in the open air, right? Very kind of 19th century, I'd say. I'd say the small scale of the mining operation also is a way to, they don't talk at all about the environment or environmental effects of mining. I mean, at worst, you see kind of small glory holes or tiny mills. And I was reading about the 2018 events in Park County, Colorado, where some members of the Gold Rush show operated a dredge near a rural area called Fairplay. And the show's presence, right, caused a lot of local consternation. There was a rezoning of land favorable to mine development by Gold Rush. There was major concerns about contamination when a dredge dug up old tailings that contained mercury. But it's like, those are all things that are happening in the news stories. You don't hear about them in the show itself. State regulators in Alaska were very worried when the show started that it was giving the wrong impression of the state, right? They were saying they were really worried that, the message that was being sent to, these millions of American viewers was that the last frontier was a land where anything goes, right? In other words, you don't hear or see or learn about the kinds of regulations they have to follow. You don't hear about the kinds of controls, right, that the company has to put in. The fact that this industry employs specialists, right, to plan for and manage environmental mitigations, right? You just don't get any of that information. It's just not part of the story that they want to tell. And the other industry that gets hidden here, the other thing I think that gets really hidden, is that the filming techniques really hide the entertainment industry, right? This is all entertainment. It's all a show for fun. That's where the cast is making most of their money, right? The TV network pays stars like Parker Schnabel like a rumored $25,000 an episode. That's at least 20 episodes in a season, plus episodes for spinoffs. So who knows how much this guy's actually making, right? I mean, his net worth is in the millions, and it has very little to do with his actual mining prowess, right? It's because he's an outspoken reality star. And the other way that the kind of entertainment industry gets hidden by these shows is that they never reveal like the camera crews who are obviously set up next to each scene, right? You don't see the people filming it. You don't learn who the people are on the crews or what roles they play or how many people are out there, right? We're just kind of supposed to think that they're independent, lonely dudes out here, right? These rugged miners out here on this kind of wilderness bereft of civilization in their view. And so, right, you get kind of all of that hidden too. And maybe my best example, which I'll spend the rest of the time talking about, is this show called Gold Rush Parker's Trail. And I would say the kind of frontier nostalgia that you see in the Gold Rush show goes to extremes in this spinoff series. Instead of showcasing modern mining, the spinoff spends even more of its time trying to connect like these like past 19th century rushes to the present. There's a Rebecca Reaver Hightower and Yane Lati have this book that I was just reading about kind of different forms of filmmaking that had to do with frontiers and what they call kind of settler colonial films. And their idea here is that these kind of shows allow descendants of settlers to relive these experiences of first generation folks to better appreciate these sacrifices and the legacy. And so what you get is kind of a recreation of the historic events, right, of this happening. And certainly that really fits this show, Gold Rush, their idea about these movies, because you get a literal recreation of the historic events, right? They replay the entire Klondike Gold Rush in the 1890s, but in the present day in this particular series. And so the 2017 season has Parker Schnabel, his foreman Rick Ness, his filmmaker friend James Lavelle, and a wilderness guide, Carla Charlton. They all decide that they're going to honor Parker's grandfather. He had recently passed away by attempting the 600-mile Chilkoot Trail from the Alaskan coast to Dawson City in the Yukon. Right, so they're going to follow the same trail that those, well, at least most of, or if not many of those 100,000 stampeders on that first rush took. Now, it's not clear exactly how the trek is going to honor his grandfather, who, despite being labeled a pioneer, did not arrive up there until at least 40 years after the Klondike Gold Rush. Schnabel's sentimental attachment to his grandfather, though, kind of quickly funnels into this nostalgia, right, for a bygone era, right? The first episode is very amusing to me because it begins by emphasizing all the difficulties they're going to face. Carla Charlton criticizes the guys for being alpha males. They haven't prepared for the trip. They haven't done any training for an expedition that's going to involve climbing and canoeing, nor are they doing the trip at an appropriate time, right? As the narrator emphasizes throughout, winter's closing in. They are leaving a couple months later than the pioneers before them. And now they have to face essentially what the narrator calls the cold, hard reality of the frozen north, but what I might call the ridiculousness of trying to do this journey in November. So, right, they're going to prospect along the way. They're going to pick up gold that they claim the original rushers missed. And just like older stories about mining, right, you really get this driven home, this idea that, they're going to struggle through this uncomfortable environment, and that's how they're going to, clearly get their riches and success. So they'll deserve it in that way. And so the elements of this show are entertaining for me too. I mean, you soon you learn that these four travelers are going to go out of their way to make this trip as hard as possible, right? And they're going to do this because that emphasizes their kind of sentimental kinship with the 1890s. And so like the filmmaker Lavelle says at one point, like, we want to be as authentic as possible. It should be as tough for us as it is for the old timers, right? And so authenticity is the way that they measure their success, right? I mean, they don't recognize that the Klondike Trail as it currently exists is not at all like it was then, right? It's radically changed over time. But, these later episodes instead, right? Like in later episodes, you see the guys have to move their canoes around modern dams, right? That's not something people are having to do, right? They also deny themselves all the time these kind of normal advantages that contemporary travelers would have, right? So there's self-inflicted suffering here, right? Is their pathway to authenticity. And being authentic, right? They call themselves some damn tough guys, right? They're going to really be individualistic and tough and resourceful. In the first part of their trip, those of you who might know this Chilkoot Trail, right? You have to go up the Golden Staircase, right? Which is this pass. You can still do it. I know people who've gone over it. And we learn, right? The narrator tells us it broke many original pioneers yet, right? But they're all going to follow Parker Schnabel's, admonition. It's Yukon or bust, right? And there's even a point at which one guy stands in the air and yells, "I'm going to beat you, nature," or something crazy like that. Anyway, so they get to play pioneer essentially in this case, right? As a way to kind of justify, right? I think it really kind of justifies their, the mining and settlement of the area in that way as kind of part of this hard-earned legacy. Okay, so then they head off on the trip here, right? And, after they climb, eventually they get in a canoe, right? They get in canoes and to do boating, to try and make it further up towards Dawson City. And really what they're facing in all these points is nature, right? Nature is their heightened risk. They face tough winds on a lake that they're supposed to canoe. And I think it's episode 1 or 2. And so they wait for a while for the winds to subside. And in the meantime, some members of the crew are like, there's a train line that goes around the lake. We could just take the train line. But, Parker Schnabel doesn't want to do this, right? He's not going to use modern technology like engines to pay ode, to these original Klondike stampeders, right? So instead of cheating, right, he's decided this is cheating. The crew instead finds a wagon that they hook on the rails, and then they move their canoes on the train line by pushing it around the first lake. Right. So it's not clear why using the rails without an engine somehow made this solution more authentic. Right. But viewers are reassured that the crew has not broken any of these imagined rules, right, that they've set. So they're able to still kind of keep playing pioneer. By episode 2, right, the crew's running out of food, and the show's narrator, tries to exaggerate the danger, telling us the crew's about to starve. And so they have to go fishing and hunting just like the original pioneers did, we're told. Of course, it's harder to hunt and fish in this kind of November frost. And then you also hear about, the bears and wolves along the trail, like as if they're going to jump out and get them. Each episode also reminds viewers of this great distance, right? It's about 600 miles total for the trip. And so this kind of heightened and often manufactured danger that's posed by nature kind of provides viewers with this reason to stay tuned, right? Protagonists, get this ability to feel virtuous, right? Appear virtuous and kind of facing off against this wilderness that's their enemy. The thing that's even weirder to me about this show is that despite the fact that this is a Gold Rush spinoff, they almost don't do any mining. Like one of the episodes, they do some mining. The small amount of prospecting that the crew actually does is also just a way for them to play pioneer. In episode 3, Schnabel decides to prospect for gold. There's still about like 360 miles from Dawson City, but they're like, well, we don't know what we're gonna have to move up our timeline, right? We're not gonna just prospect around there. So they dig out some dirt. They use a pan to look for some gold flakes. They see some promise, so they craft kind of a makeshift rocker box. They use a canoe paddle, a wool shirt, I think some nearby trees, right, that they're going to use to separate the gold from the gravel. And they find a few flakes of gold, and they decide they're going to stake a claim for this spot, likely more for the sake of the show, right, than as an actual prospect to mine. They name this claim Perseverance, right, in honor of their grit that they showed and that the Klondike Originals rushers showed, right? And it's also, I think it was also the name of one of the crew members' grandfather's trawler boats, something like that, who had recently passed away. In other words, they're like trying to connect this kind of, personal mourning to the frontier myth, right? The mourning justifies the mining, so to speak, right? And during this episode, right, you only see those kind of techniques, right? We're told this is the authentic way to prospect, right? And Parker Schnabel says something like, this isn't the mother lode, but we found it just like the way the old timers did, right? So you really get kind of a glorifying of small scale mining. And the one example I can think of that this is kind of like in pop culture was, I don't know if anyone's ever seen Clint Eastwood's Western, The Pale Rider. It's kind of a weird Western because a lot of its goal is to really criticize this, environmental destruction caused by a large mining enterprise. And yet it also presents this alternative to corporate mining, right? This kind of loving, cooperative community of small scale, like, tin panners. They're just trying to provide for their families, not trying to amass great wealth. Like it's a hydraulic mining corporation. And I'd say just like that, right? It kind of waxes nostalgic for, these miners living their own kind of version of the strenuous life, right? Small scale mining is this
warning, Brian.
What was that? 5-minute warning? Great. So, you get this kind of long-standing weird representation. All right, click us through here. It also doesn't match the late 19th century Klondike, right? No matter how democratic shows like Gold Rush make the Klondike out to be, right? As a mining phenomenon, the Klondike was really emblematic of the decisive shift away from individual and small-scale mining towards highly capitalized, technology-intensive extraction methods. During the initial stages of the rush, so many people took small claims in the Yukon, they denuded the landscape. And then by 1899, miners had already begun mechanizing their operations, right? They were steam thawing the tundra. That led to steam engines running hoists, steam shovels digging up creek beds, some hydraulic mining systems. All of that used wage labor, not independent producers. In other words, even during the original Klondike rush, mining practices quickly became labor and capital intensive, and miners became wage workers, right? So that's another thing that gets kind of hidden. It's the funniest part about this show is that the crew's journey to the Klondike ends abruptly in like episode 4, or maybe it's 3. And it's because, while attempting to disembark from his canoe, Parker Schnabel slips on ice. He falls into freezing water. They're worried about him catching hypothermia. So, they decide to abandon the whole trip. And we're told, that this is not a failure, right? They made a valiant effort, right? They showed determination, right? And so that's what makes it okay. And so again, I think the other funny part about this is, they portray this as if nature has simply won the battle this time, right? They've lost the battle at the frozen north, really removing blame for this failure from the crew themselves, right? Despite the crew's lack of preparation, their late departure date, their insistence on being authentic, their ineffective methods, right? It's still okay, right? Because nature just sometimes wins, right? And, the other funny part about this is that you almost never see people during the show, except for a couple of times. And once is when they end up in Whitehorse, right? Which they claim is one of the only true signs of civilization. It's a city of about 25,000 people. And, this essentially kind of makes this area look much more marginal and uninhabited than it actually is.
Let's wait a minute.
And so what you get instead, right, is this portrayal that, well, Whitehorse is the only place that's inhabited. And they even stop off and have a drink in the bar and stay in the hotel. And we're told that's okay because during the original Klondike rush, people went to Whitehorse and hung out there. In fact, that's where Donald Trump's grandfather set up a saloon and perhaps a prostitution ring. Right? So you get like these kind of like weird stories that try to connect you. They also even at one point the reason why they have to stop in Whitehorse is because one of the crew members has injured his foot. And you get this heartwarming story about perseverance as he explains that his own relative once hurt a foot in the backcountry, but still had to walk for miles. So like even a foot injury gets a sentimental connection to the frontier. And so I think it's just kind of quirky and funny. The one thing that I wanted to bring up to conclude here is that there's only one woman right along on this trip. She's the only one who actually has skills and training. She's the one, like, while they're off bungling around, she's the one who catches all the fish. She sets up their camp. She tends to do most of their cooking. But I mean, eventually you learn in like later, like backstory episodes after the show that, you know, she's really the reason why most of this is happening. You know, and they kind of play up, you know, the fact that she has Yukon roots, right? They call it Yukon blood, right? Really kind of like naturalizing and nativizing her and these other people, like that they're supposed to be there, that they're, you know, kind of lost, or that they're, you know, connected to the pioneers in that sense, right? And so again, kind of a quirky part of this. So what you get here in Gold Rush Parker's Trail is a mining adventure story that uses frontier nostalgia to really hide reality, right? When people make bad decisions, you can blame it on the mystic frozen north. When actual mining appears, you're just kind of sentimentally connected to the past to pretend that's what, you know, most mining looks like. You'll learn a lot about the Klondike Gold Rush, but not much about like how it actually happened or what people did after they made it to up to the Yukon. In other words, right, just like older stories about the American West and the Canadian North, right, you get kind of, again, these stories about kind of rugged individuals, you know, doing this like small scale enterprise, you know, and democratically making their way. And so like the workforce, we don't hear about employees, you don't hear about families, you don't hear about, you know, the only environmental concern is the inhospitable North. So really, I'd argue this is kind of an imagined past that gets kind of covers up the modern day story of mining. And then I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you very much, Brian. Okay, open up for questions, comments.
Got a question for Brian. We know how the Discovery Channel audience has reacted to these shows. They've got great ratings. Do you have any evidence or information on how the real mining industry views these shows? I mean, do they watch them to laugh or they ignore them altogether? Do you have any insights on that?
That's a really good question. I mean, you know, I've heard a little bit of both. I mean, the folks that I know from FURAs, some of it's laughing. I mean, of course, everyone recognizes why these shows exist and what they're trying to do, and that it's it's clearly all for entertainment. And so I know folks in the mining industry who watch it and, you know, they kind of giggle along. I mean, they're certainly not taking the thing seriously. It is kind of interesting as to Johnny wrote, the kind of mundaneness of the actual working life. There's a lot of boring that goes into these jobs. And, you know, I think in some ways, right, that's what they want to hide, right? I mean, that's why these, you know, you get all the drama played up and all these kind of small scale adventures along the way. And that's probably why you get a show that's all about people traveling to mining as opposed to actually doing the mining, even though they sell it as a show about mining. I've heard a little bit of both, but I'd be interested to hear more from other folks if they know anything about, you know, other kinds of industry reactions. I mean, I've seen a few some companies have put out a few statements here and there, but mostly they've been statements. There was one after they got in trouble in Fairplay, Colorado for their operation. There was a few companies that operated near there that were just like, that wasn't us. We don't have anything to do with Gold Rush. We're not to blame. Like that was the few statements. So sometimes I think it worries people in the mining industry because you get this very strange impression, right, from these shows about what they do and, you know, they're kind of, you know, their actual practices.
It's important to remember that, you know, a book about mining history compresses time, and a movie about mining, about a book, compresses it further, and a reality show compresses it further, and that's part of the thing, because it doesn't
Yeah.
show the people eating and going to the bathroom and just sitting at their desk or doing the mundane thing that nobody would be interested in.
That's a great point. Yeah, and I mean, and they, they do everything in their power to make these things exciting. I mean, the heavy-handed narration always stands out to me when I watch these shows. I mean, especially these kind of like adventure narratives where you get, they're certainly saying things that I don't think they care. The cast members are not going to be saying, right? Where they're like, especially to try and emphasize just how dangerous it is and how they're at their last drop, and and so I think that's also part of it, right? Part of the way that they make that drama.
I think from a viewer standpoint, what drives you absolutely wacky with these shows is that they have so many commercial breaks, and then after commercial break, they'll replay practically half of what went on before it. So they only have to add a small increment to the ongoing story. I mean, it's
Yes.
It's sort of like when you get a 42-minute, 1 hour show on public TV these days. You don't have commercials, but you have nothing but other fill-in stuff,
Yeah, and then you get to the second episode, and they recap like the entire last 3 or 4 episodes before you do. You're right. There's very little actual content happening in some of these.
Right.
Yeah, it's amazing. I don't know. I mean, again, I know these people are paid by the episode. Maybe that's what's going on.
Brian,
Yeah.
have you ever watched American Gold? So
No, I don't think
Fox
I've ever
Business
watched.
Network.
I haven't. Clearly, I should.
It's possibly one of the best when it's about a bunch of brothers. Almost all of them are either graduate geologists or mining engineers from Montana, and they're trying to reopen an old family property. And it's rather interesting. There are a bunch of old stoked up duffers doing it, but at least they're rooted in reality.
That does sound quite different.
Yeah, what was the name of that show, Bill? What was the name of it?
What'd you say, Mike?
I was wondering I didn't catch the name of the show that Bill was just talking about.
Called American Gold, and it's shows occasionally on the Fox Business Channel.
Oh, okay.
It doesn't seem to have a regular pattern this year, but the episodes have been somewhat interesting. Of course, in these reality shows, you have to take a little for granted.
Sure.
Yeah, I think they're definitely like different levels. I mean, I think that the kind of more typical Gold Rush show outside of these, like these adventure ones, like the Parker Schnabel's, or Parker's Trail, it tends to be much more like he's traveling somewhere, like they're going to South America and they're going to open up a thing, but they're clearly not really doing much. And there's like a levels in between some of these. It sounds like maybe American Gold's one end where we get a little bit more realism. The normal Gold Rush show has a fair amount of realism built into it, and then there are a few other shows like I'm gonna try and remember. Anyone's ever seen Ice Cold Gold? They travel to Greenland. I've never seen this. I mean, that one is for me like one of the most ridiculously dramatic ones. I mean, I don't even know. I think I've only watched the first season, but the first 4 or 5 episodes, they didn't even get to where they're supposed to be, where they actually have a claim to mine. So they're just like walking around the mountains because the weather's bad, and so there's like they're like right up above a town, and they spend their whole time talking about how they're well, this really bodes well for when they actually make it to where they're going to mine, as they like stumble around above the city. But they pretend like it's this dramatic adventure that's happening.
Okay, any other comments, questions?
I have a question, kind of on the have you seen this front again? So I initially got interested in mining history through the documentary Dawson City Frozen Time. Have you seen it?
No,
And
I know it, but I've not seen it.
oh, okay. Well, then that kind of negates my next question,
Oh,
which is
okay.
which was going to be, what is your read of that film on this basis of like narrative versus reality? But yeah. So let me awkwardly back out of this question.
No, that's fine. What's your take on it? I mean, I know the movie because I have a friend who does research up there who just told me to watch it too. But
Oh yeah, no, I mean the thing that like really struck me about it is that it's kind of the, using this footage that exists of the Klondike Gold Rush under fringe circumstances to tell the story of it, and also kind of how like North American capitalism and the entertainment industry coalesced around it. And just given that was kind of my jumping off point for getting into all this stuff.
That's something where they found all these reels or something, right? And
yeah, it was in Dawson City, like the some like bank manager in the city who was in charge of like also the film distribution line, like just threw all these reels underneath a hockey rink. Where they stayed for most of the 20th century, and then were accidentally dug up again once the recreation center got torn down, and then they were unearthed. And at that point, people are like, "Whoa, there's all these nitrate films that didn't survive because every other copy of these burned up because they are highly flammable." So that's kind of the story with that. But yeah,
it's a very Canadian story. Mining town loses films under hockey rink.
Yeah, it is highly Canadian. I can say that much.
Thanks, Preston. I'll check it out. It's next on my list.
Okay, anything now? Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you very much to Brian. Good presentation.
Thanks for coming.
And everybody else for attending. We'll see a lot of you, I hope, next month in Birmingham, and everybody else in September.
All righty.